Hey, Calvin here, and this is my 12.9-inch M1 iPad Pro that I upgraded to just a few months ago, and it is honestly probably one of my most favorite pieces of technology ever. So my very first iPad Pro was the 2018 11-inch first gen iPad Pro, and I got it as a Christmas gift from my sister, and it completely changed my life. It completely changed how I thought about productivity, and it completely changed my workflow. I ended up using that iPad Pro for so many different things, from journaling to note taking to sketching and drawing to editing things. And it was just such a fun and cool experience that for the longest time, I actually tried to switch my entire workflow to an iPad Pro first workflow. And it sort of worked out. Sometimes it would last about a week, sometimes a month. But I noticed that I always ended up switching back to my MacBook Pro that I had at that time, just because the MacBook Pro had more of the things that I needed in order to get a lot of the stuff that I needed to do done. However, that dream of switching to an iPad Pro first workflow never went away. And very recently, just I would say about 3 or 4 months ago, I ended up switching completely to an iPad Pro first workflow. However, I did have to make a few sacrifices and I did have to change my mentality a little bit. So in this video, I want to share that experience and hopefully give all of you guys a bunch of tips and strategies and tactics that you could potentially use to switch to an iPad Pro first workflow if that's something you're considering doing. Okay, so let's start off with tip number 1, and that is limit your options. I used to have a bunch of different devices and I would use each device for particular things, and that made it harder to sort of zone in and focus on a particular device. Now, when you have a lot of options, it really makes it difficult to try to make one particular device your primary computer or primary piece of tech that you use to get things done with. However, when you limit yourself with the number of options that you have, you're sort of forced to make certain compromises and certain changes in order to get a particular device to be your primary device. So just this past summer, about 6-7 months ago, there was a point where I had an iPad Pro, obviously I had my iPhone, and then I had a MacBook Pro where its screen was actually broken, so I was using it as a desktop replacement. But then I also had a MacBook Air for all my portability go-to apps that I needed that couldn't be on my iPad, and it was too much. So I ended up cutting down my devices to where now I only have an iPad Pro, and then I have a Mac Studio that I use as a desktop setup, and I'll get to that in a moment, but that is my secondary device, whereas my iPad Pro is my first device. So now the point is, I only have an iPad Pro as my primary device, and that's what I use to get a lot of my work done, whereas you use my Mac Studio to get basically everything else that the iPad Pro can't do done. So I ended up selling my MacBook Air, and then I got rid of my MacBook Pro, and then I was only left with 2 devices, my iPad and my Mac. And so in some sense, I was forced to utilize the iPad Pro, and I'm glad I went through that experience, because had I not, I would not be having an iPad Pro first workflow. So for this very first tip, if you have too many devices, consider getting rid of some of them and making your iPad your primary device, and it will sort of force you to get used to having the iPad as your only device. Okay, tip number 2, change your mentality. This is an iPad. This is not a Mac. And I know there's a lot of people who complain about not basically having Mac OS on their iPad. And again, that's because an iPad is not a Mac. It does not run Mac OS, it runs iPad OS. So stop complaining that it doesn't have what you want it to have. Instead, treat the iPad like an iPad and treat the Mac like a Mac. However, the thing that I had to change about my mentality when I switched to this workflow was that I understood that the iPad was an iPad. And in my mind, I chose to make it my primary device. And I chose to make my Mac a secondary device. Now, when I was going through this shift, there was one question that I discovered that really helped me change my mindset about how I viewed my iPad and how I viewed my Mac. And that was, whenever I decided I needed to do something that required a computer, I would ask myself, can I do this thing that I'm about to do on my iPad, even if it takes a little bit more effort. Now, if the answer was yes, then in my mind, I would say, okay, I'm just going to use my iPad for this, even if it would be far easier to just go on my Mac and do it. And the point of that exercise was to get used to and be more comfortable with iPad OS and sort of its limitations and be able to understand its strengths. Because I think a lot of the times when people complain that iPads don't have Mac OS, it's simply because they don't understand the strengths of what an iPad is and what it can accomplish. Now, there's going to be a lot of things on the iPad that are very difficult to do, and it would be far easier to do them on the Mac. And I'll get to that in a later tip. But the point is, whenever you have something you need to do that requires a piece of tech, ask yourself, can I do this on my iPad? And if the answer is yes, even if it takes a little bit more effort, try to do it on your iPad. And that really helped me change my perspective on what I thought an iPad could do. And it ended up being really beneficial when I decided to switch completely to an iPad Pro first workflow. Okay, tip number 3, utilize the Files app. Now, the Files app on the iPad, I treat it very much like what Finder is on Mac. Obviously, Mac's Finder is a little bit more versatile than iPad's primary Files app. However, because I use Files as my primary storage solution, it's really cool because you can connect all your other cloud storages like Dropbox or Box or Google Drive to the Files app, and it's a nice way to keep all of your documents central in just one simple place. So when I open up my Files app, it essentially is Finder, and I can do all sorts of stuff on it like drag and drop files, edit folders, etc. And more importantly, a lot of the documents that I have from movies and pictures and just Word documents and all sorts of other stuff, I keep on my iPad because, again, I want it to be my primary device. So I took basically all of my documents that I used to just throw in the Documents folder on my Mac and I moved them to my iPad. So not only do I have complete access to everything I need on the go, but it's also a great, simple way to organize all of the work files that you have right on your iPad. Okay, tip number 4, make your home screen very functional. The idea here is that you want your home screen to be so functional and so inviting that you enjoy coming back to it every time you need to open up your iPad or get something done. So I am very productivity focused, and on my home screen, I have specific widgets on my home screen that allow me to zone in on things that I need to do on my calendar. I have a to-do list, and I just have other priority apps that I use very extensively right on my home screen. Now, for the dock, I sort of treat the dock like I do on my Mac dock. And that is, I keep certain primary apps on that dock at all times. So things like the App Store, the Settings app, Files, Calendar, Safari. I keep all of those applications right on my dock, again, because it's very easy to get to those apps, and it really helps when I start doing multitasking on the iPad. It's very easy to just open an app and then open another app right next to it because all of those important applications are right there on the dock. So this tip really is spend time making your home screen very functional, very inviting, and fit it to your workflow. Okay, step number 5, and that is learn the multitasking on your iPad. Now, the multitasking setup on iPad is actually really, really good. But people complain about it because it's not the same type of multitasking on macOS. On macOS, you can have all sorts of windows open. They can be on all sorts of different desktops, and sometimes that just gets very overwhelming. The idea behind iPad's multitasking set is that it's meant to be very, very focused. And sometimes when you have too many things open, yeah, you might feel like you're being more productive, but really you end up just being very overwhelmed with all the applications and all of the windows, and they're just kind of all over the place, and you don't have a focused workflow to get your stuff done. And this is where I think a lot of people end up complaining about iPad's multitasking setup, and that is just because they're comparing it to what's available on macOS instead of understanding why iPad's multitasking is the way that it is and why it's actually really good. Again, iPad's workflow is, or its multitasking set, is meant to be very, very focused. Now, Apple in WWDC 2022, so last year at the time of recording this, they introduced Stage Manager, which for me is a big fat no. Now, Stage Manager inherently is not that bad, but the problem that I have with it is that it takes away from the focused multitasking setup that iPad used to have, and it just brings in a lot of the clutter and sort of the overwhelming experience that you get when you have way too many windows open. If you have a lot of windows open and a lot of apps going, you're probably not being very focused in the stuff that you're trying to do. But I mean, if you use Stage Manager, it's fine. It's there on the iPad. I personally have it turned off, and I think iPad's original multitasking setup actually works really, really well for me. Now, it does take some time to get used to iPad's multitasking feature set, so I would say, number one, try to spend some time getting used to it and understand what it was built for. And I think iPad's standard multitasking works very well for me just because it allows me to stay focused on particular tasks. And it just allows me to get a lot more done. So if you guys actually want a video on how I do multitasking and all the tips and tricks that I have for that, let me know. I can definitely make a video on that. And I think it's a lot of fun. If you take the time to get used to multitasking on an iPad, I think you can get more done on an iPad than you can on a Mac. Okay, tip number 6, upgrade your hardware. Obviously, this is a very budget-focused topic, so if your budget allows for it, try to make your iPad Pro setup a little bit more versatile with accessories. So for me personally, I have obviously the iPad Pro. I have a matte screen protector on the screen so that when I'm journaling or drawing, it feels a little bit more paper-like. And then I have a Magic Keyboard because I like the versatility of a physical keyboard as well as the trackpad. It allows the iPad to be a little bit more like a PC or a laptop, but it still has the versatility and uniqueness of what a tablet computer is. Now for my particular iPad, I do have the larger 12.9-inch screen, and I think having that extra real estate really helps when you're trying to multitask and do a bunch of stuff. It was definitely a big upgrade from my 11-inch, and this is just something that comes down to sort of a personal decision, right? If you have the budget for it, I would recommend getting the larger screen, but I think you can do quite a bit on just the 11-inch if that's just what your budget allows for. And then storage. So storage, I upgraded my iPad Pro to 256 gigs. It's definitely more than the 64 gigs I had on my 11-inch iPad. But again, I wanted that extra space just so I could store more stuff on it and make it feel like a primary device. Now, if you're short on storage, you can also get external storage. Now, the iPad Pros nowadays have very fast USB-C ports, so you can get portable SSDs that can read and write very, very fast, and you can do things like photo editing, video editing, and pretty much anything else that requires external storage pretty fast and very well on the iPad. Okay, finally, the last tip, tip number 7. This might be a little contradicting, but this tip is have a secondary device if you need it. Now, I never said that the iPad that I have right now is my only device. I said that it was my primary device. Now, I understand that I can't do everything that I need to do solely on my iPad. And for that, I actually have a Mac desktop. And I think that works out really well. Again, a few tips ago, I said that when I had to change my mentality of switching to an iPad Pro first workflow, I always had to ask myself, whenever I needed to do something, could I do this on my iPad first? And if I could, even if it took a little bit more effort, then I would do it on my iPad, and it worked out really well. However, there are certain things that I do that I simply cannot do on an iPad. So for me personally, I edit using Final Cut Pro, and that is not available for iPad. I also do software development for mobile apps, and the tools that we need, Android Studio and Xcode, do not run on the iPad. And so for those particular workflows, I do have a Mac Studio where I do all of that stuff on. Now, that doesn't mean that I use my Mac for other things that I could do on my iPad. It just means that I do have a secondary device if I need it. And for my workflow, I do need a secondary device. So don't think that when you're switching to an iPad Pro first workflow that your iPad should be your only device. That's not how this is meant to be. The iPad Pro is my primary device, and I try to use it for as many things as I can. And it works out really, really well, especially when I need to get up and go somewhere else or work at a coffee shop or go to the library. I can do most of my workflow on the iPad. But again, there are just some things that you just can't do on an iPad, and for that reason, I would recommend getting a secondary device. Now, if you're on a budget, you could always get a small laptop or even a Mac Mini. For me personally, I had to get a Mac Studio just because I needed the extra power when I'm doing things like video editing and working on mobile app projects in Xcode or Android Studio. But you should decide for yourself how you sort of want to set that up. And there's nothing wrong with getting a used small Mac Mini if you just really need a Mac setup for particular things in your workflow. And it's sort of nice having that secondary device because everything that I do on my iPad, I store on my iPad, and some of the stuff I do have on cloud storage systems, but I always back up my iPad to my Mac Studio. And so my Mac Studio sort of acts as a reserve or like a backup sort of a device where I can do everything that I need on my iPad, but then be very comfortable in knowing that a lot of that stuff is already backed up to my Mac. Okay, so that's all the tips that I have for you. Obviously, I love my iPad and I love using it. It's just so versatile, so much fun. I use it for all sorts of things, from doing productivity to editing videos and photos to just consuming media and playing games. And it's worked out really well for me, and I plan to continue using this iPad as my primary device for hopefully months and years to come. I think it's only going to get better, and hopefully some of these tips and tricks and strategies have helped you identify how you could possibly change your workflow to be more iPad friendly or iPad first. And that's probably one of the most important things to remember, is that you do need to be flexible. You can't be so stringent on trying to basically get Apple to put Mac OS on an iPad. Would that ever happen? Maybe. I don't know. All I know is that as the iPad is right now, I really enjoy using it. I think it's a very focused and fun workflow, and it's just such a cool device. And yeah, I love it so much. So thank you guys for watching. If there's anything else that you would like to know about my iPad setup, my workflow, the apps that I use, or anything else, let me know down in the comments, and I'll be sure to address them and maybe even make a video on something. All right, I will catch you guys all in the next one. See ya.